Oh, we're going. Okay. All right. We are finally ready to talk some history again. Working on my second book. Obviously, staying on the subject of Lincoln, mid 19th century America Civil War. And I'm going back a little into antebellum in this book. The title is not set in stone yet, but it is related or clarifies to my son and I's first book, which is basically articulating the fact that the version of Abraham Lincoln that we know in popular history and in most of our American education, and thereby worldwide education, is inaccurate. It does not follow with not only the primary sources of the day, but it doesn't follow what Lincoln described himself or his motivations as. The Father Abraham, great emancipator, that was not only something that he did not own, it was something that he consistently rejected or repelled when it was projected onto him. He that just wasn't Abraham Lincoln's fight. Abraham Lincoln was not a social justice advocate. He was an American. He was an American that had every reason to believe in the American dream. He had every reason to believe in the American dream because he experienced it. He grew up in abject poverty, received little to no education. Most of his education was educating himself, going to college, all that kind of stuff. He just didn't do. And he still rose to a level of prominence as an attorney, held seats in national office, and ultimately became president of the United States. So he really went from zero to hero. And that was where his mind was affixed, was the beauty and the provisions of the country. And he belonged to the group that had the best provisions. And thereby it just wasn't a huge concern of his to change that. That's what he constantly said. Now, he was not in favor of slavery, but not necessarily an advocate for the slave. He just thought, in principle, any system that a man is not getting the benefit of his labor, he thought that was wrong. Not enough to stop it, but in theory, that's not good. And also, slavery interrupted the wage economies that was developing in the North. So you got to remember, he was born in Kentucky, but he's an Indiana, Illinois guy, right? When he was in the Senate, he was in Illinois. He was in Congress, he was in Illinois. So why do we have this story of Lincoln? And this is what the first book covers, is because the story of Lincoln overlaps the story of the Civil War. And the Civil War has been given several narratives. We have one thing that's called the Southern strategy. And you see that today, where Southerners repurpose their role and outcome of the Civil War. You'll hear a lot of people defending the Confederate battle flag, stars and bars, the Dukes of Hazzard flag. Generally when you see white supremacists, you'll see Southern white supremacists, because you had racism in the North, you got slavery in the South, and the two mindsets haven't really changed. You have to understand that. After slavery, we had segregation that was endorsed by the entire country. That was Plessy versus Ferguson, put down by the United States Supreme Court, separate but equal. So the country, North, South, East, and West, divided Black people and put Black people in second-class citizenship. So Southern people catching the bulk of that wrath is really unfair. That was a white American thing, and still is. The Democrats nor the Republicans truly have a desire to level the playing field, which would cause for repair for the things that have been done to Native Americans, to Mexicans, and to Black people in particular, and in many cases, Asian people. But the second book that I'm writing is touching on how early this great emancipator, advocate of Black people, abolitionist persona was projected onto Abraham Lincoln. Now, why is that persona so important? Which was the point I was trying to get to earlier before I got sidetracked. Americans have turned, the South turned the Civil War to a narrative that they wanted, knowing that being the Southern strategy. You can look it up. This is not something I'm making up. The North, and the two have come together, over time, but the North made this strategy, or pretty much white America has repurposed the Civil War as the redemption of the country, and thereby the redemption of white people. The country's biggest sin, many times which you'll hear slavery referred to as, which I dare to argue, even as a Black person, that was not our country's biggest sin. Our country's biggest sin is definitely what happened to the Native Americans. But are we going to compare holocausts? No. But that is recognized by American whites as the country's biggest sins, completely ignoring what they did to Native Americans and what they're still doing to Native Americans. You got to remember that up until 5 years ago, we had a football team called the Redskins. Really? The guy said, I'm never going to change it. And that was not just an outrage to the people that were offended. That was ignored by people in this day that's offended if you are in this day that we're supposed to respect all kinds of perspectives of identification and gender fluidity and all of these things. Those same people in majority could not recognize how a term about a group's skin was offensive to them, and that needed to be addressed. But we can talk about all these other things and have people lose their jobs because somebody's offended about something. But Native Americans they just don't matter. That being said, this narrative that has been created by white America to absolve future white Americans of their complicit bias against Black people has been embodied in this Civil War, where the half of the whites of the country fought half of the other whites in the name of righteousness, when that is not what happened. Whites were fighting for whites. White Northerners were fighting for their economy. Southerners were fighting for their economy, and no one was fighting for the Black people. They were fighting against economic systems. Nobody was fighting for Black people until 1863, January 1st, when Lincoln started having the Black people enter the military. Now, he didn't do that because he recognized Black people as equals. They got paid less. They were segregated. Many of them were attacked by white soldiers. It was huge problems. And when he was addressed, that was the primary reason why Harriet Tubman did not like him. Frederick Douglass spoke to him about that. And his thing was, oh, we got to start somewhere. But basically, the South was using the slaves as military labor. They were keeping Black folks out, and that was causing all kinds of problems for industry. That was causing all kinds of problems in white deaths and just being outnumbered. So that was why he had to even the playing field and use these bodies for target practice at the very least to help out the North, because the North was losing before Black people entered the Civil War. That's just a chronological fact. It was probably 49 battles to 50. It was close, but the North was losing. It definitely wasn't in favor of the North. So that's why when you hear people say that Black people freed themselves, white people didn't free Black people, that is the truth. There were not white people fighting for Black people. Now, again, I'm speaking very broadly. History is a broad thing. There may be individuals that say, hey, this is a wrong thing. History does not support that, but it's possible. It's really not probable with the given time. But what is definite is that Black people fought for their physical freedom as well as their civic freedom. And whites have made the Civil War the redemption of the country and the redemption of a race. Now, you have to understand all of the lynching and the police dogs and the marching and the Jim Crow and Nat Turner and church bombs. All of those things was after slavery. That's after slavery. So we have to start thinking logically of, if half the country, if half the whites were fighting for social equity, why did the next 100 years end up full of, I don't know why my camera is going out of focus. Okay, let's get focused. All right. So if half of the country was supportive of Black equality and freedom, why was it until 1965 that we got the Voters' Rights Act, in 1964 that we got the Civil Rights Bill, which were restatements of the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, slavery being controlled by the judiciary, equal protection under the law, in voting for black people. They ignored these laws because 65 is slavery under the judiciary. 68 is equal protection under the law. 70, 18. 70 is voting. It's all the way until 65, 100 years after that you could vote unabated. That we still don't have equal protection under the law. We just saw that since 2016 and up through COVID, of how black people can be killed by police officers for nonviolent crimes. And most of white America does not care. They assume something, that there is some logic in that outcome. They assume some good in that outcome. That is the majority of white America in that situation. The politicians of the 80s and 90s have admitted that the war on drugs disproportionately affected black people. Those same people have admitted that mass incarceration disproportionately has affected black people. Now, nobody has reversed those laws. They reversed the crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, but letting people out of jail, rehabilitating these people, reparations to those people, because you notice reparations is always, how do we know who was enslaved? Okay, repair the people that you put in prison all that time and made billions of dollars for these companies like Boeing and Walmart and Idaho Potatoes and Victoria's Secret, because the people in prison were working. And then you all made mandatory minimums, 3-strike rules, truth in sentencing to keep people in jail longer, to work longer for these companies. Repair those people. And that's just like in 1865, when the South didn't want to pay reparations to the actual slaves. Now they're saying, oh, we don't know who the slaves were. You didn't want to do it then, just like they don't want to do it now. So so that's why the redemption story is so important. Because if we reveal that America was never redeemed, we have to now look at what happened to those problems that are still in our society today. So the second book is pointing out how early this projection of this redemption or this redemptive nature occurred, and they embodied white America in Abraham Lincoln. And I mistakenly originally thought that this projection upon Lincoln was posthumous, but it wasn't. It wasn't even during his presidency. It started much earlier. It started as early as the Lincoln-Douglas debates that occurred in 1858. He was running for a senatorial seat against Stephen A. Douglas. Stephen A. Douglas was a very famous senator who is most known for popular sovereignty. Now, Stephen A. Douglas was a lot like Lincoln. He really didn't care about slavery, left or right. He was trying to be the next president. So he's trying to appease both people. But he said flat out, I don't care. If they voted, if what his thought was popular sovereignty is, let the people that live there vote if they want it or not. Which, if you take their vote if they want it or not. Which, if you take the moral stuff out of it, that's a very democratic perspective. It's a very democratic perspective. He's saying, we're a democracy. Let the state vote if they want slavery or not. I don't care if it's voted up or down, but let them vote for it. That was what popular sovereignty said. Lincoln, too, didn't care if slavery existed. He said, well, you know, slavery will run itself out after time. It may be 100 years. So he knew it wasn't going to run itself out in his lifetime. He said it may take 100 years or so, but it's going to run itself out. So let's not spread it into the other areas. Let's let the other economies grow, because the slavocracy was butting heads with those who were not enslaved states. So what we're talking about is representatives in the government. The representatives make the laws better for their economy and harder for the economies that they're not in. The slavocracy had more power, and the people who weren't under the slavocracy were fighting for power. So now they have taken this land from Mexico. Who is going to get this voting power and thereby the power over resources? That's what all this is about. This is not about color. That is an excuse for access to wealth. So Stephen A. Douglas is saying, let them vote for it. Saying, no, we got some growing economies that need to take place. Now, understand, the northern economies were living off of slavery. Textiles, selling foods, factories. They were using the processed goods from slavery. The insurance companies, the banks. So the whole country was living off of slavery. But they didn't own slaves, not because they were good people, because it wasn't, the winters were bad. This is bottom line. They didn't have a climate for it. If you're in Illinois, and anybody from Chicago, where I grew up, you get about 4 or 5, maybe 6 months of bad weather, cold weather. What are you doing with your slaves then? You gonna take care of people for half of the year when nothing's growing, nothing, the ground's frozen, you can't dig nothing up? Why are you? It just didn't make economic sense. They were still racist. They didn't want slavery in Illinois. Thereby, they didn't want no black people in Illinois. So this book that I'm working on now is going back as early as the Lincoln-Douglas debates and seeing that this imagery of Lincoln as an abolitionist, this imagery of Lincoln as an emancipator, this image of Lincoln as a friend to black people was actually a political ploy to make most of white America dislike him. And he constantly defended himself. Now, the sad part is, all Lincoln historians know this. You are not a Lincoln historian if you are not familiar with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They may not have thought about it in the context in which I'm presenting it, but they know he defended himself against being called a black Republican or an abolitionist. He constantly, his entire career as a politician, including presidency, felt that abolitionists were extremists. So he never liked abolitionists. There was no legislation Lincoln passed that did not preserve slavery, including the 13th Amendment. But it was as early as 1858 that we see this image being put on him and he defending himself against that image. So even before the narrative of reconciliation of whites, there was a story that had existed before that was adopted, that was just a political mark to make him lose an election, which he lost because of this image. And it's an image that he rejected and spoke out against his entire presidency, because obviously 2 years later he was elected president of the United States and went in through the Civil War. But the new book is going into where this connection to Lincoln and altruism toward blacks started. And to see that it was prior to his presidency was surprising. So we're going to get back into our series of Lincoln. We're going to let today's politics go. And we're really going to get back into Lincoln and pick these pages back up. This will help me process through the book. One thing that we're going to talk about in the next video is how similar Lincoln and Douglas were. Very similar. They were similar in their thought processes. They were similar in their circumstances within their political parties as they were running for senatorial office in 1858.